Well, hi there, students. This is Mr. V, and today we're going to discuss basic landscape, the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Well, what are they? Well, they're the most basic pieces of a landscape piece. Anytime you're going to draw a landscape, an image of scenery, any type of scenic image, telling a story through simple examination of the surrounding environment, anytime you make a landscape, typically it's composed of three major pieces, and those pieces are a foreground, middle ground, and a background. So let's take a look at some facts and characteristics. A foreground is the plane that is closest to the viewer. It has a couple of roles. It doesn't just sit there. It's not there just to look pretty. The person drawing or even photographing the landscape uses the foreground for a couple of reasons. One, to frame the piece. Another use of the foreground is to create a sense of scale. When things are right up close in your face, you see more of it, and so you see more detail in the foreground. The foreground has the most detail out of all of them. And so if you want to show how big everything else is in the piece, that's a great way for your viewer to understand how far away things are in your piece, how big things are in your piece, and so on. The background is the plane that's furthest away from the viewer. It has the least amount of detail. It's also not very bold. And it also, just like the foreground, frames the piece just as well. So typically, if you have a frame, there has to be something in between the frame that's being shown off. If you've seen the Mona Lisa, the frame sits around it. The Mona Lisa is the whole purpose of the piece, right? Well, that brings us to the middle ground. The middle ground is in between the fore and the background. Its purpose is to tell the story of the piece. The middle ground's purpose typically is to show off the whole focal point of what the artist was trying to snap a photograph of. Now in art, there's changes in this. I mean, you might see a photograph with only a foreground and only a background. There might just be just a middle ground and a background. It can change, but as beginning students, focus on this. The middle ground has the story and it has the focal point. It shows off the whole point of the work. So if you're going to do a picture of, say, like a garbage truck, well, you would naturally want to have that in the middle ground and then have a plane in front of the garbage truck to frame the piece, show a sense of depth and scale and detail. So let's look at some examples. Now, a composition means how things are arranged within a piece, how they're made up, how the piece is actually composed of all the different parts within it. And strong landscapes have what we call a dynamic composition, meaning things change and they get really crazy and they use exaggeration and they have very unique and interesting layouts in them. So if you want to have a strong composition, I strongly suggest that in your landscapes you avoid flat lines, perfectly flat lines. Even if the landscape that you're drawing is flat, you should throw something in the foreground to offset all that. It makes it look interesting. Let's look at the mountains. Notice again how the foreground slopes. It's not flat. The middle ground slopes and intersects, and then the background kind of frames the whole piece. It's kind of like a Z shape. Well, that's a dynamic composition. It's not just a flat, boring, straight line. It's interesting. It's fun to look at. It has energy. It has life, depth, and so on. And also just a storytelling point. Use the middle ground to tell your story. And in this case of the story, the river and the valley is the whole focus of the piece. The side of the mountain that's right in our face, that's not the focus of the piece. The whole purpose of showing this grand expanse, that's the focal point of the piece, and that is what the middle ground is. Let's look at a non-example. This is actually a caliber work I see frequently in class from students who do not use the actual techniques in order to create a landscape. They revert back to what they're comfortable with, or trying to do the minimal amount of work. Well, this is an example of what a landscape is not. Notice how flat everything is. You guys are coming out of perspective drawing, meaning you know how to use a horizon line and depth and perspective and how to simulate that depth. Well, landscapes, you would use all of that, especially for blocky buildings like this. You know, these would need to be in perspective. This piece is flat. It looks almost as if each element in the piece, like the mountains, the buildings, and windows, and so on, are just cut out pieces of paper stuck on a wall somewhere. So, and also this piece lacks a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. It doesn't have a background? What about the mountains? Well, how do I know how big the mountains are, how far away they are? The houses sit smack dab on the horizon line. There's so much wrong with this piece technically that I could go on and on. But there's no way that we can tell the difference between each plane. And how do we tell the difference between each plane? Let's jump right back up to facts and characteristics. Here's how you can tell how to separate your planes from each other. It's important to note that planes are not objects. They're not things in your piece. They're not trees. They're not rivers. They're not clouds and so on. Planes, once again, are areas of space that have defined borders, kind of like a checkerboard. You know how where each checker begins and ends because each area has a border to it. Well, planes begin and end in your piece if you can tell where they begin and end, if they're intersected by another plane, if an object obscures part of that plane, and so on. Well, let's look again at this non-example. Where does the mountains end and where do they begin? There's no begin or end to them. Where's the ground that the houses are sitting on? Where does that begin and end? Can't tell. It's just a line drawn on paper. To top it off, something to definitely avoid is that sun up in the corner of the paper. That doesn't exist in nature. As a matter of fact, if it were daytime, you wouldn't see the sun in your piece at all. You would see all the light that's cast on the surface. Avoid that. The only way you ever draw a body or an element up in the sky like that would maybe be at night when the moon is rising up over the horizon, or if you're trying to show a sunrise or a sunset. But typically avoid putting the sun in the corner of your piece. It draws the eye away from the whole purpose of it. So this piece, what could it have used? Well, for starters, avoid flatness. Have more planes that overlap and intersect to give it a sense of depth. Give the ground life. Very rarely do you find really interesting photographs that are perfectly flat like this. Also, the houses are sitting on the horizon line. Avoid that. Give your pieces depth. Stagger your forms. Have some far away, some up close. Have them intersect that horizon line, sitting above it, below it, and so on. Alrighty, let's have a look at a couple of examples of different photographs. Where can you in this image see the foreground, middle ground, and background? And how can you know that? Well, in this image, the foreground is defined as the plane that's closest to the viewer. Also, it's got the most detail. And if we look in this image over here, we can see on the left, the plane that's closest to us is the side of the mountain where the mountain climbers are on. The next furthest away plane would be this entire area down here. Now, how do we know where that begins and that ends and where it turns into the background? Well, the background kind of blends into the foreground in this piece. That's because there are clouds in the middle ground, and those same clouds continue off into the background. You basically have to draw a line in your mind where that background is, and in my opinion, the background is where this mountain starts. The purpose of this piece is this vast expanse. It's to show off how high they are. It's to show off this really crazy scene of elevation. So these mountains are only there to frame the image. So we know that that's the background. Everything above this area is background. That goes for the sky as well. The sky is just there to help frame it, just like this side of the mountain is there to frame the whole purpose of the piece. This one's an interesting one. Where is the foreground? Where's the middle ground? Where's the background? Well, the foreground, once again, is to frame the piece. That would be this cliffside and this ground right here. And notice, we've got a flat line, but it doesn't stay flat. It turns into the side of a cliff. Still dynamic, still interesting. The whole purpose of this piece is about what? The waterfall. Therefore, this is the middle ground, right over here. Well, where the heck is the background? Well, in this case, the only background that we have would probably be the top of this little cloud that's visible and the blue sky. For your work, I recommend against drawing just solid colors for backgrounds. Now, here's a cool one. Where is the foreground, where's the middle ground, and where's the background? Well, the foreground frames the image. It's got the most detail, and it's very bold. When I say detail, I mean where you can see the intricate parts of how things work. Just because it's solid black doesn't mean it has less detail than all of the clouds that are off in the middle ground over here. We see blades of grass. We see the shoulders and head and torso and legs of this form here, something we wouldn't see if it was really far off in the distance. So the foreground is the black silhouette here of the ground with the character standing. The middle ground is the whole point of the image, which is this vast cloudscape. And then finally, it's framed by a sunset with a sky above. And notice again, where are the flat lines? There are none. It's a strong composition. The ground here is sloped slightly. Also, we got a massive pillar of cloud that intersects the whole thing and gives it a sense of scale and size. We compare this teeny tiny little person to this vast cloud, and we know this cloud is between us and this sea of clouds. So that makes this sea of clouds all the more epic and interesting. Alrighty, let's take a look at this one. Let's break it down. How can we tell where the foreground begins and ends? As a matter of fact, where is the foreground? Well, it's the plane closest to us. The middle ground, we can tell which one that is because that's the whole point of the piece. The whole point of this piece are these beautiful green mountains. So we can tell that this would be the middle ground. It's also the plane furthest away after the foreground. The background, well, that would be the plane that's further behind the middle ground, and that would be the sky and part of this mountain right over here that's obscured and kind of foggy off in the distance. This would be the foreground. The middle ground is the whole purpose of the piece. Therefore, this would be the middle ground portion. And lastly, the piece off in the distance, that would be what green represents. That's the background. Okay, to review, the three main components of any landscape are a foreground, middle ground, and a background. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, ask me in class, and feel free to rewind and pause and look other parts of the screencast over again. So I look forward to seeing you. Have a great day.